I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
With those words, the presidency of Richard Nixon came to an end on August the 8th, 1974. In the 2 years preceding Nixon's resignation, Americans were glued to television sets watching the Watergate scandal unfold. The chain of events began in 1972 with an overnight break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters located in the Watergate Hotel. The burglars had connections to the Nixon re-election committee. Nixon had recorded his conversations. A special prosecutor subpoenaed those tapes and found that an 18-minute section had been erased.
Well, I'm not a crook.
That led to a Senate investigation, charges of obstruction of justice, and calls for impeachment.
What did the president know, and when did he know it?
That question, among others, was investigated by a team working for the special prosecutor. The only woman on the team was 30-year-old Jill Wine-Banks, at a time when women attorneys were a rarity and sexism was pervasive. She was often called the lady lawyer, a label she summarily rejected.
I do object to the term lady lawyer. I'm a trial lawyer or a criminal lawyer or a litigator. I am not a lady lawyer. There is no such thing as a lady lawyer.
Wine-Banks played a major role in the Watergate hearings, cross-examining Nixon's assistant, Rosemary Woods, about the gap in the tapes. She went on to become the first woman general counsel of the Army, followed by a successful career in private practice and in business. Today, you can see her as a legal analyst on MSNBC. Wine-Banks has written a book about her time as a Watergate special prosecutor. The Watergate Girl is a behind-the-scenes eyewitness account of a young female trailblazing attorney investigating misconduct at the highest levels of government. Jill Wine-Banks, thank you so much for being with us here today to talk about your book, The Watergate Girl.
Thank you, Kathy. I am very delighted to be here.
So your book, I'm curious about so many things about it and your life story. This is a memoir of your time as a member of the special prosecutors team during Watergate. I'm curious, when did you decide to write this book? Was it in the works before the past few years' events or what?
Yes, and it's actually a sort of a longer answer than you might expect. I was encouraged to write this book right after Watergate. A book agent had placed an article for me in Red Book magazine, which still exists, and encouraged me to expand it into a book. And I'm just too busy with my career. I don't have time. I'm not doing it. But it was also at that time because I thought I didn't have the perspective that I would need to add some value to the conversation, and because I was insecure enough that I thought I didn't have anything really meaningful to say. But then in 2008, I theoretically retired. I flew to Italy to be with very good friends, and they said, okay, you've not written this book that we've been encouraging you to write for many years. Now you have time, you should write it. So in 2008, I started drafting an outline for the book and made a sort of effort. I went back to the book agent who had encouraged me in 1976, who was semi-retired by then, and I didn't make the right effort. But then came 2017, and I got really serious. I had written a substantial amount before that, and I actually had gotten an agent. But it didn't sell. And then in 2017, I thought, I now am on MSNBC and I have an audience. At the time I first started writing then, I had maybe 40,000 followers on Twitter. I now have almost 500,000. And so I had an audience. I went back to writing just about the time that Donald Trump was elected. And I was accepted to a program at Ragdale, which is an arts community in the Illinois area. And one of the writers that I got to know there, named Rita Dragonette, called me after we returned from Ragdale and said, I just read about a course in how to write an op-ed, and I bet you have something to say. So I signed up for the course. It was an all-day Sunday, and it was Sunday before the Tuesday that Comey was fired. So I finished this one-day course on Sunday. On Tuesday, I had something to say about a topic in the news. I wrote an op-ed. It was published on Friday. And on Friday, I started getting calls from every network saying, we'd love for you to be on to talk about what you just wrote. And that eventually led to my contract with MSNBC. So it's been quite a ride. And as you know from my book, I graduated college with a degree in journalism and wanted to be a journalist, but went to law school in order to get a good job on a newspaper where I could cover either law or politics. Because of sexism back when I graduated in 1964, girls, as we were called, which also explains the title of my book, Watergate Girl, girls were offered jobs on what was called the woman's page. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do hardcore news. So law school was not intended to make me a lawyer. It was intended to make me a reporter. And it did, but it took about 50 years.
Well, and in the meantime, you did quite a few interesting things and had a great career. It was quite a time to be a young prosecutor, and you were only 30, and you were the only woman on this team. What was that like?
It was exactly like anyone who grew up in that era would expect. And I hope it will remind people today, not only what it was like, but to make them aware that we've made progress, but we have not come to equality. I was the only woman, and that's because at the time that we're talking about, only 4% of all lawyers were women. And of that 4%, almost none were trial lawyers. Women tended into other areas of legal practice. And so it isn't surprising that I was the only woman on the trial team. And it isn't surprising that men didn't always know how to treat me, and that there was a lot of sexism, not only in the courtroom, but, you know, if we can go back, let me just say, in writing the book, I came to realize how much sexism and sex discrimination influenced my life. I did not really realize it until, remember I said I started writing an outline. And so I was putting down, you know, what are the stories that I would want to share with people? You know, what should my friends know? And therefore also the readers, because I wrote this book as if I was talking to friends, being totally candid, sharing a lot of personal things, which, by the way, many of my Watergate colleagues tried to dissuade me from doing. But I felt it was very much a part of the story. And so I realized when I looked at the list of stories that most of them involved some form of sexist treatment I got, whether it was Judge Sirica interrupting questioning with what anyone would consider a sexist remark, whether it was one of the key witnesses in the case, Jeb Magruder, when he first met me, looking at me when someone offered coffee, not me offering coffee, but one of the men in the room offered coffee, and he turned to me to say, I'll take mine black, assuming that I was a secretary and that was my job. That's why I was there. Whether it was questions I was asked in job interviews about what kind of birth control do you use? How many children do you plan to have? Whether it was my fellow classmates saying, what are you doing here? You're taking the place of someone who will be drafted to Vietnam and die there because you took their rightful place. Those were realities back then. And so it made women, it made me, I'm not going to say all women, but it made me insecure because I was treated as an outsider and as different. And it did make women have to be better than men to get half as much recognition. When I became general counsel of the Army, one of the things I'm proud of is that my successor was a woman. I didn't mess up, and they didn't say a woman can't do this job. We'll never hire another woman. So I think opening doors for other women is part of the burden of being the first. And I'm very happy to have done that. In the Pentagon, one of the things I worked on was abolishing the Women's Army Corps, the WACs. And you might say, well, why would you want to do that? And the reason is that if you look at how many generals the Women's Army Corps had, the answer is 2. If you look at how many the regular Army had, it's hundreds. And so if you want women to advance to be generals, they have to be part of the regular Army, not the Women's Army. And I saw the consequences of that when I was on a Pentagon commission recently studying sexual assault in the military. And one of the panels coming in to testify before the commission was a group of 5 generals and 1 admiral. And the lowest ranking person was a brigadier general, which is a 1-star. And the 1-star was the only man on the panel. So every other person on that panel outranked him and was female. And that, it brought tears to my eyes to think that that only could have happened by abolishing the Women's Army Corps.
You really were a pioneer for so many women who came after.
Part of what I want people to know is that obviously I have reinvented myself because I've been a prosecutor, I've been a defense lawyer, I've also been a business person. And I've done that in both the not-for-profit world and the for-profit world. Women tend to think that unless they have 100% of the qualifications, they can't take on a job. They won't even apply for it. Men think if they have 1 out of 10, it's enough and they're qualified. I try not to think about things like that because a lot of the challenges I've taken on, I probably wouldn't have done if I really analyzed it. I probably wouldn't have started law school if I had known the challenge I was taking on. But I am sure glad that I did.
In your book, you talk about interviewing Rosemary Woods, then President Nixon's secretary. Can you just tell us a little bit about that? That was some great moments in your memoir.
Let me start by saying to call her a secretary is really not accurate. She was Richard Nixon's secretary. That was her title at first. She became eventually a personal assistant, but throughout the period, she was an advisor to him. She really was someone he relied on for political and substantive advice. She was a very close member of his family. She traded clothes with his wife, Pat. She was called aunt by his 2 daughters. It's not fair to say secretary, which nowadays has a different meaning than it did then. Back then, a secretary was someone who took dictation and transcribed it. But she did much more than that. And I learned even more about her as I was writing the book and research. And for example, listened to tape recordings of her conversations with Richard Nixon, not part of the tapes we subpoenaed, but just conversations. And you could hear how much he relies on her. We started work as Watergate special prosecutors in May of '73, less than a year after the burglary that was called the Watergate break-in. In July, so shortly after that, one of the White House witnesses called before the Senate testified that there were tape recordings of all the conversations. By then, we had already talked to John Dean and knew about a number of very incriminating conversations that he had had with the president and others that we suspected from his calendar entries would be very criminally involved. So we immediately subpoenaed, we selected 9 tapes, and we asked for those 9 that we felt we could overcome any legitimate claim of executive privilege by explaining that these were for criminal purposes. The president decided that he was going to stonewall us. He said, nope, you can't have them. We got a court order. He said, I don't care. I'm not giving them to you. We went further to another court, still wouldn't give them to us. And we had a press conference on Saturday, October 20th. So we're still, pretty early on in the process. And Archibald Cox, who was the special prosecutor, explained to the American people why we needed the tapes and why we had a right to them. And Richard Nixon, instead of being moved by that, as was the American public, who started protesting his stonewalling, he said, no, not doing it. And the pressure of the public became so intense that he 3 days later said, okay, I'll give you them and I will appoint a new special prosecutor, because by then he had fired Archibald Cox and his attorney general and his deputy attorney general and had abolished our office. 3 days later, he undid it because of public pressure, which I want to point out is a significant thing that America needs to keep in mind right now as we are in a very fraught time. Public pressure, politicians respond to. Anyway, so then he said, we'll give you the tapes. Then he said, that was October 23rd. Then at the end of the month, on Halloween, he said, whoops, there are 2 that don't exist. I can't give them to you. I can explain. One was from the White House residence, and that's not on the taping system. The other, there was a malfunction. The machine that tapes back up to the second tape, it ran out of tape and the second tape didn't start. We had a hearing about that. It ended, and a few weeks later, on the day before Thanksgiving, on a Wednesday before Thanksgiving, so I think it was November 20 something, he said, come back to court. There's a third tape, and it has an 18.5-minute gap. Richard Benveniste and I were the only 2 lawyers doing the questioning of White House witnesses about these missing tapes. And after a day or so of the hearings, I said, Rick, you're taking too many witnesses. I'm going to take the next witness the White House calls, and I'm going to take every other witness after that. We're sharing equally. And he said, oh, yeah. But if I hadn't spoken up, that wouldn't have happened, I guarantee it. And the next witness called was Rosemary Woods. During that first hearing about the 2 missing tapes, she was what was known as a chain of custody witness, just saying, yes, I touched them, I handled them. She wasn't the prime suspect in criminal erasure of evidence. But when they called us back the day before Thanksgiving, they said, there's an 18.5-minute hum where there should be conversation, and we can find no innocent explanation. The only person who you can ask about this is Rosemary Woods. Since she was my witness in the first hearing, she was my witness in the second. I had to violate the rules of every lawyer in cross-examination. Never ask a question you don't know the answer to, because all I knew was that the White House said, you'll have to ask her how it happened. And so I didn't know what she was going to say, but I had to say, okay, tell us what you did. And she said, I was listening to this particular tape and the telephone rang. And she said, so I reached for the phone, and instead of turning off the machine by pressing stop, I accidentally hit record. By the way, a button on the machine that's a completely different color than all the others, so that it would be a big warning that you're pressing something different. She said, I hit the record button, I reached for the phone, and I kept my foot on the pedal under the desk, because otherwise it wouldn't keep rotating and therefore there'd be no erasure. Now that sounded incredible to me. So I said, could you demonstrate exactly what you did? And in the courtroom, she sort of pointed toward the machine, and just pointing, before she even reached, her foot came off the pedal and you could see the tape machine stop. The press ran from the room to call in the story, because back then there were no cell phones. So there were banks of payphones for people who still remember those, to call in the story. And she muttered, well, it's different in my office. I could do it there. And so I said, well, Your Honor, maybe we should adjourn to her office and she could demonstrate there. And that led to the picture of the stretch, the evidence photograph that was taken in the White House, where she was able to manage to accomplish reaching the phone. But it was the front page of every newspaper and magazine. and it became fodder for many cartoons. Everyone looking at it knew the way she was holding on to her chair, white knuckled and reaching, she could not have stayed in that position for 18 and a half minutes. No one would. If you're on a wheelchair, you would have taken your foot off the pedal and put yourself to the telephone. So the picture proved in ways that words couldn't that she was lying, that she had not done what she did. Further scientific analysis showed that the tape had been erased not in one fell swoop. It had been erased approximately 8 times. And that became one of the turning points in Watergate. It became a time when the public went, we can see that the White House is lying. We can see they can't be trusted. And it really changed public perception. So it was a very significant moment.
Did that prove to people that, do you think that Richard Nixon erased the tape?
To this day, we don't have a definitive answer. We know that it was not an accidental erasure. We know it was deliberate. We know that the erasure started and stopped exactly when the conversation was Watergate. And the reason we know that is that the conversation was between the president and Haldeman, who was his chief of staff. And Haldeman was a prolific note taker, and we subpoenaed his notes. And his notes you can follow on the tape, and all of a sudden the buzz starts as soon as that conversation ends. And the next thing in his notes is Watergate, PR effort. So it was clearly not an accident that it got deleted exactly for the Watergate part. I have a theory, but there is no proof of who actually did it. It seems likely to me that Richard Nixon was involved, that it was the first tape on our subpoena. And so if before you were going to turn them over, you wanted to listen, which we know he did because we have tapes of him listening to the tapes, that if you wanted to hear it, you would play that one first because it's first on the subpoena. And he must have listened and gone, oh, that sounds bad, I'll erase it. And then he listens some more and he erases more, and then it's all done. And he goes on to the second tape. And then he goes, oh, this is bad too. I can't erase all of them. I'm just going to adopt a stonewall attitude. I'm going to refuse to give any tapes to the prosecutors. There is a question of why he didn't destroy them. Many people urged him to. We got the subpoena to him within a week, and he didn't do it by then, and then it became criminal. If he destroyed them, it would have been a criminal obstruction, plain and simple, too obvious. So that's why it didn't happen. If we had taken longer to do it, I think he probably would have listened to all those who were advising him to erase them. Why he blamed Rosemary is I think she actually, when she came to the erasure, she thought she had done it for some reason. She ran into his office to tell him, and I think he saw an opportunity to cover his tracks. And if it wasn't him, he knew who did it, and he knew it wasn't her. And after her loyalty to him for so many years, I'm appalled that he would have turned on her and let her take the blame and live the rest of her life in somewhat of humiliation.
What is your opinion of how the Trump impeachment went versus the Nixon impeachment, and where we are today in holding officials accountable for actions?
Oh, it's very different today, obviously. My fight for justice during Watergate worked. We had justice. Democracy worked. There was bipartisanship. There was agreement on what the facts were. Today we live in bubbles. We do not agree on the facts. Those of us who listen to MSNBC believe one set of information, and those who listen to Fox believe a completely different set of things they are told. During Watergate, the impeachment, which is done by there were 2 things involved in Watergate. There was a Senate hearing under Sam Ervin that was looking at what kind of legislation might be needed to protect against the kind of conduct that was going on. It wasn't a criminal investigation, and it wasn't an impeachment. It was just really legislative. And it led to campaign reforms, for example, that make a difference, although they have been undone by a very terrible Supreme Court case called Citizens United, Much of the campaign finance reforms were undone. And campaign money is what paid for the original Watergate break-in. A tape known as the smoking gun tape had become public, that we had gotten because the Supreme Court upheld our right to have the tapes. And in that tape, you could hear Richard Nixon say, well, let's use the CIA to stop the FBI. I don't want them following the chain of money, and we can do this. You also hear conversations where he says, yes, I know where we can get $1 million to pay off the burglars to keep them quiet. And at that point, the Republicans said, these are facts. They went to the White House, the three top Republicans, and said, President Nixon, if you do not resign, you will be convicted in the Senate. And the next day he announced his resignation, and the day after that, he flew away from the White House. After that conversation with the three top Republicans, this was the leader of the House and Senate and Barry Goldwater, who had been the presidential candidate before that. He went to Rosemary Woods and said, I'm resigning. You have to tell my wife and daughters. He didn't have I don't know what the right word is. He didn't want to tell them. He wanted her, and she is the one who actually told them that he was resigning.
Did you write a lot of this from memory, or did you have to go back and research a lot? Because it's so detailed. You must have a wonderful memory.
I did write the first draft completely from memory. And then I started doing research. So for example, if we look at the picture of the Rosemary stretch, I had described everything, including the dress that she was wearing, which I remembered vividly because it was a very colorful dress. And I remembered it. But I wanted to make sure that I was accurate. So I pulled up online a picture of the Rosemary stretch. She was wearing a pin, which, because I've become so known for my pins, is very ironic to me. But if you look closely at that picture, you will see she has a pin on. And I also called many of my colleagues to make sure that they remembered things the same way I did. I would say largely my memory was correct as to all of the really significant details. And it's surprising how much you do remember. This was a very, very major thing. The hard part for me was, what stories do I include and what stories don't I include? I had a fabulous editor, Paul Golub at Holt, who really gave me basically two rules. He said, it goes in if it relates to obstacles you overcame, and if it's a unique viewpoint that you have about the Watergate case. But even then, there were stories that I thought were wonderful stories that didn't get included. So for every example that's in the book, there's probably 10 that aren't in the book.
Will you be writing another book?
Well, there's two possible things that I might do. One is I've been encouraged to write a book about my pins, and they do tell the story of the Trump administration, because I have always tried to wear pins on MSNBC that relate to the story of the day. And so it would be easy to have that converted, and I am thinking about it. And one of my Twitter followers sent me the best title for that book. I'm not going to share it because if I write it, I want it to be a surprise. I also have learned more information. You mentioned that I had been portrayed Rosemary Woods sympathetically. And I did, because as I got to know her through the few days that we were together, but more in following her life after that and in doing research for the book, I really did feel sympathy for her and how she had been treated. And I tried to interview people who knew her as a friend or family member, but they all thought I was an enemy, that I had gone out to embarrass her, which I didn't. A prosecutor is someone who wants the truth. We want the facts. And that's all I did. If she was embarrassed, it's because of how she testified. I didn't put those words in her mouth. She put them in her mouth. But I was frustrated in not being able to get the kind of information I wanted. And I said something like that on Fresh Air on NPR. And almost immediately, her grandnephew called me and said that he would be happy to talk to me. And I've had a wonderful conversation with him, and I've learned a lot more about Rose. So maybe I would write an article about Rose and her role in this, and some of the things that I've learned about her as a human being that I find interesting and different than I would have expected. But right now, I'm very happy with where I am in this, and the paperback edition is coming out in March of next year, and I may go back to writing some more op-eds since that started my whole new career.
Fascinating stuff. Thank you so much, Jill Wine-Banks, for being with us to talk about your fascinating book, The Watergate Girl.